What's going on, everyone? Welcome to Midcurve. Don't know what episode this is, doesn't matter. But of course, we are here with the famous Austin, formerly of the Solana Foundation and now of DoubleZero. So today, I think we're going to talk about DoubleZero. But I want to start off with I want to start off with something. You and I have had two interactions, one in real life, one online, and you have
Uh-huh.
roasted me in both of them. Just roasted me.
Oh no, I don't remember this. What did we do?
So the first one we were in Utah, and the judo guys had just played a golf tournament, and I was like, yeah, man, I was driving the ball really far today, and then you were just like, yeah, but aren't we at altitude? I'm just like immediately just brings me down a couple pegs, and for those of you that don't know, the golf ball flies a lot farther at altitude. So that was one time, and I was just like walking away. I was like, man, I was just like so down on myself after that. It was like in the nicest way possible, but at the same time, like my confidence was just shot in my golf game. The
Sorry,
second
man.
time, oh, it's all good. The second time though was we did a short video and we were just like reviewing coffee in Japan, and you're just like, really? You're like blue
Oh,
bottle?
blue bottle.
You're yeah. I was like, what is it with this guy? He cannot, he can't stop roasting me on.
Imagine
But
living with me.
I, man, I
I feel
know.
bad for my partner.
I do. I feel bad too. No, no, both interactions were awesome. And I get it. I told you online, like I used to own a coffee shop and coffee company,
Yeah, you
and
get it.
but I get it. I would have roasted someone for that too. But it's like when you're just trying to make stuff and you're at Blue Bottle, might as well do a coffee review. You know what I mean?
The aesthetic's great.
The
Blue bottle's
extent.
got a nice aesthetic.
Thank you. And
Yes.
for your information, right now, I am drinking a Colombian coffee from a boutique roaster here in the
Nice.
Northwest. Um, and I told your team we should definitely get out and do like a coffee review or
Oh
something
yeah,
in New York in person. That would be a lot of fun.
that'd be great.
So, okay. So I cleared my chest. I cleared my conscience with that rant. Let's start off with, for the people who maybe don't know you, I'm not sure if anyone watching this doesn't know you, but if they don't, give me the spiel on who you are and what you're doing.
Sure. I'm Austin Federa. I got in the crypto space in, I'd say, late 2017 by working for a fintech company that was rapidly failing and trying to pivot and build a borrow lend token on Ethereum. We would have called this DeFi a few years later, but at the time it was just like a weird system. But it really got me into this from like a conceptual standpoint of, okay, so if we're gonna look at smart contracts and think, oh, these are not actually smart contracts, whatever people think that term means. These are on chain programs. And that was one of the main learning moments for me of like, okay, this stuff is actually interesting. There's a lot going on here. I was never really one of those like bunker Bitcoin people. I was like, oh, great. Like World War III happens. Like, I guess we still have Bitcoin. Like that felt like a very tenuous pitch for crypto to me. Um, so I got the bug. I went and ran marketing for Republic and launched Republic Crypto with them for about a year and a half. Worked for some stealth infrastructure companies in crypto that didn't really go anywhere before joining Bison Trails, where I was running kind of product marketing and working on some of the platform stuff with a bunch of like really awesome folks there. And that ended up getting acquired and becoming Coinbase Cloud. And so Joe and Aaron and Victor and a bunch of folks like continued on and worked for Coinbase for a few years. But I didn't really want to do the Coinbase thing, like nothing against Coinbase, but it was even at the time, it was a very large company gearing up for an IPO. It is still a very large company. And it just felt like it wasn't like the place where I could learn the most. And so I was interviewing with a bunch of L1s and L2s, and this is when like sharding was all the rage, and these sorts of things. This is the end of 2020, and I've been working on ETH2 infrastructure at Bison Trails at the time. We were sort of one of the first to support staking for the Beacon chain, all these types of things. The classic bridge that was not a bridge; it was just a one-way contract, but everyone called it the bridge to ETH2, which is always funny. Um, and a guy we used to work with at Republic, Ben Sparango, hit me up and was like, "Hey, you should talk to Raj and Toli about Solana." And I was like, "I don't know. Like, I worked with like 20 different protocols at Bison Trails. Like, we technically supported Solana, but we never talked to a single person from Solana." Like, no, just hear me out. Get on the call. And so I got on a call with Raj and Toli, and I think 30 hours later we had a signed offer letter to join the team at Solana Labs. I think Solana's market cap was like $300 million at the time or something like that. It was like it was very early days. But the thing I saw, like I asked Anatoly, I was like, so I've been working on like ETH2 infrastructure back when we called it ETH2, and there's this thing I can't get around, which is like, doesn't are we fracturing the state? Like, how is DeFi gonna work when you can't have like trust between different parts of the state? Like, and this whole thing, I was like, I must be missing something. There's a lot of very smart people looking at this future. I was like, are we gonna get like the Uniswap chain? Are we gonna get like the balancer chain? Are we gonna get the curve chain? Like, this feels bad for composability. He just sort of laughs. He goes, yeah, that's never gonna work. Like, we're building stuff in one global state. And it was kind of that moment where I'd love to say I was prescient and saw that Solana was going to go to $100 billion someday. But really, what I saw is like, this is a zag at one point where everyone's doing a zig. And I'm going to learn a ton working for these folks, even if the project crashes and burns. And, that was 4.5 years ago at this point.
Mm, that's right. So then you went on to work for Solana Foundation. What was the experience like there?
It was the best on the job training you could have to become a founder. I think foundations at the time were largely considered irrelevant and like bureaucratic, like check boxes that you had to do. I mean, for years, just look at the Ethereum Foundation relative to consensus, let alone like any other foundation out in the space, especially in like that 2018 to like 2023 timeline. And Solana took the foundation role seriously. It was not just like, oh, the money's all over here, so we need some dudes in Switzerland to like sign some paperwork. It was like, no, we're gonna make this like a real thing, and it was a real thing even from the start. And so you learn a lot about how to set, uh, I would say, incentive alignment between labs and foundation teams, because sort of like if you're aiming for Mars, like if you're 0.5% off on your trajectory, like you're gonna hit Jupiter instead. And you have, so like these organizations, you can't just rely on people being good people, right? You have to say, like, how are we setting up reward structures, incentive structures, technology structures, feedback mechanisms, checks and balances, all these types of systems to make sure that the foundation doesn't go rogue and the labs team doesn't go rogue. And you can bring in additional core contributors, and you can move a bunch of engineers out to Anza, and you could do a really expensive project like Fire Dancer. And all of these things are not going to like break the fundamental fabric and culture of the network. Because at the end of the day, like the point of all of this stuff is for founders to be able to build cool shit, right? To build very useful applications and services and generate revenue. And like, I hate calling crypto a platform, because platform is such like a web to SaaS term, but it is a platform, right? The definition of a platform is you can build something on it more valuable than the thing. The sum total of all of the companies built on AWS is much more valuable than AWS is worth. This is the definition of a platform system. And so I think that for me, like working up at, I was originally at Solana Labs, and then I transitioned out to the Solana Foundation. And it was just like a really great experience of like being, on a leadership group there and being able to see like, how do you actually build these things well for the long term? There's a lot that the Solana Foundation got wrong, but I think they got more right than sort of any other foundation in the space. And it's still the example I give when people hit me up and they're like, "Hey, our L2 needs a foundation, or, our new L1 needs a foundation." It's like, okay, well, like Solana Foundation did this pretty well. Like, that's a good model. Like, go talk to Elena, go talk to Lily. Like, there's a lot of people there who like know how to do this and can help through that process.
That's good alpha right there, actually. Um, so let's get into the meat of what we're here to talk about. You built something called Double Zero, or you are in the process on the team of building something called Double Zero. And again, this podcast is called Midcurve. So
Yeah.
can you maybe explain what Double Zero is in simple terms?
Sure. So DoubleZero is at its core a rethink of the communication layers between high performance distributed systems. And maybe that's not mid-curvy enough,
That's not
but
Midcurve enough.
okay, it's a new internet for
There you
blockchain.
go. There you go.
Yeah. So, like, you can think about this as like right now we have all of these validators all over the world, and they're all talking to each other over the public internet. And like, I guess if you take back, like, there's the Bitcoin view of the world, which is like hash power is king and you have to not trust anyone. And that's why like there's still a satellite up there that's just like beaming down Bitcoin blocks. Like you can actually validate Bitcoin with no connection to the internet. That's super cool. Everything else I think is pretty mid-curve, right? Oh, we need home stakers. It's like, okay, but like 50% of your home stakers are just running on AWS. Like, yes, it's technically possible to run it at home, but we have ISP monopolies in the entire developed world. I don't have 6 options for internet service providers at my house in New York, let alone like right now where I'm out in Montana. Like there's one, there's Starlink. And if they decide they're going to censor Bitcoin blocks or Ethereum blocks, like good luck. Um, and so there's a lot of this stuff that gets pretty mid curve pretty quickly when you're like, oh, but we can technically run them from home. And it's like, I get it. I get it. I get why this matters. But like, put the satellites in space, do the FM radio thing, and like make it, able to be validated on a dial up modem connection or something like that, or just accept that what we're building are high performance distributed systems and you need censorship resistance, credible neutrality. You need all of these things that are very important for diversification. But at the end of the day, the point of DoubleZero is we know better ways to move data around the world than using the public internet. And we've known it for 20 years or more. Um, every single large company utilizes private networking and private fiber. And so if you are in the Google offices in New York, you can pull files from the Google file server in San Francisco, and it's not going over the public internet. They have 100 gigabits of fiber linking all of their offices and building this giant global network. And they're kind of an extreme example, but Bank of America has this, eBay has this, right? All of these companies have this because when you're talking about servicing a global communications system, which the internet is, you run into the traffic jam problem pretty quickly, especially when you're going from one continent to another. And if you run a Solana validator today, you know that like it's pretty rough to get from Amsterdam to Tokyo. There's a lot of packet loss, there's a lot of jitter, there's a lot of latency, and that's because there aren't that many cables actually running between those two locations. And the ones that are, there's a huge amount of demand for them. And so the idea behind DoubleZero is could we utilize the best of private networking and private fiber, but do it in a way that we have multiple independent contributors running those network connections and giving us cryptographic assurances and economic security behind that data, but being able to do this at 100 times, 1,000 times the speed and performance that you can get over the public internet.
Um, that's really interesting. I remember I did finance in college, and I remember hearing about this about HFT funds like digging lines from Chicago to New York just to be able to place
Yeah.
trades faster, right? So you said that there's congestion from like Amsterdam to Tokyo, right? Is there private lines going from Amsterdam to Tokyo right now?
Oh, yeah. So the thing to remember is when a company comes in and says, we're going to run an undersea cable, or we're going to dig up the ground outside of your house and run, fiber down it. What they're doing is they're overrunning the fiber because it's very expensive to dig stuff. It's very expensive to run these subsea cables. And so what they do is they usually run more fiber than they need for just the needs of today. But the other thing is the technology of actually like so maybe this is worth like fiber is a piece of glass, right? It's one long piece of glass, or there's joiners in it, but those sorts of things. But effectively, what this is you're shining a laser through it, right? And because it's a fiber optic, it passes light very efficiently through it, and that is decoded at the end of each piece of fiber into data. Now, this is like a gross oversimplification of how it works, but you can use multiple spectrums of light and send multiple different wavelengths of light over the same piece of glass. And that technology gets better and better and better every year, right? You can now do over 100 different wavelengths of light over the same piece of fiber if it's modern, well-built fiber. And even the fiber that was run 10 or 20 years ago, you can upgrade these optical network terminals on the end, and so you can sort of get more capacity out of the same piece of fiber. A crude analogy for this is like coax. If you have like coax coming into your house for like cable television, you're like, oh, there's like 700 different channels. The reason they're called channels is you're literally decoding different streams at different pieces of spectrum to get those television stations. And so fiber effectively works the same way. The technology is very different, but at the end of the day, we're doing the same thing, which is that we're using different spectrum in order to send data at different times. And so this is a long way of getting to answer your question of yes. So when a company runs these large cables, they may dedicate, okay, like 2/3 of this is going to be used for the public internet. And they're going to, eventually that's how your packets from, Verizon or your, whatever get all the way under an undersea cable and they pop up in Tokyo if you're trying to load like the railway for like, the railway website to buy like some rail tickets before your trip to Japan, as we all do when we go to Japan, you take the Shinkansen. That is the thing that you do. Your computer is talking to a server in Japan and it's running over subsea cables. Now there is a lot of, I wouldn't call it necessarily like excess capacity is sort of a hard terminology because it's not like there's not a lot of unused fiber out there, but what there are is there might be wavelengths on a piece of fiber that are just not used today, right? And so the companies come in and they've built a 16-lane highway and they only have enough traffic for 4, but they're willing to sell you an extra lane in that highway. And that's effectively what we're doing and our contributors are doing is no one's laying new fiber for DoubleZero. What they're doing is they're taking leases on existing fiber, or what they've done is they've taken a lease for, say, 200 gigabits per second of data from, one place to another place. And they're saying, well, I can carve out 50 gigabits of that and use that for DoubleZero and earn some tokens on that. And so there is actually a lot of, I would call it available fiber and available spectrum around the world because everything from trading firms to offices to all sorts of things make use of this. Like a classic example of this is like ESPN, right? Like ESPN actually at this point, if you're watching like a college sports like football game or something like that, that's all being actually mixed in Atlanta. All the directors are in Atlanta, all the people like calling the shots and picking what scenes actually go on TV, that's happening from their control center. And so there's fiber that they've basically taken leases on all around the country that's bringing the signals from the camera. The cameras nowadays, they have fiber that plugs into the bottom of the camera. And so its video feed is going straight to the ESPN like control center where they're mixing stuff. Um, and so they're only able to do something like that. ESPN's not going out and paying hundreds of millions of dollars to run fiber everywhere. They're tapping into the existing network and they're leasing space on it. And sometimes they're only leasing that space for the season, right? And then they're turning it off when the games aren't on. So there's a lot of really interesting variability that comes into these modern fiber networks, but none of it's used today in blockchain because blockchain people are usually afraid of anything that's not software.
Gotcha. Okay, so that actually leads into my next question was like, what was this aha moment, or did you have an aha moment where you were like, okay, this is a problem. This
Yeah.
is a problem that I'm interested in working on, and yeah, what was that?
So one of the co-founders of DoubleZero, Matteo, actually had this idea back in 2016, 2017. And he pitched a few people in building it back then. He's a hardcore telecom guy, like worked for the first company that ran global fiber around the world and has worked for like high frequency trading firms, ran a telecommunications company for a while doing fiber for Central and South America. But he pitched this to a few people back in 2017, being like, look, if the crypto vision is actually going to be real, like we can't run this stuff on the public internet. But back then, the fastest blockchain in the world was Ethereum doing 14 things per second, right? And just it never made any sense. That wasn't the right time, but he could sort of see into the future that something like a Solana or an Aptos or a Sui or a Mega ETH or a Monad would exist at some point in the future, and it would need these types of network techniques. So that was his sort of like, revolution moment here. He was just a little early. So for me, it came working on the FireDancer project and talking to the engineers there saying, yeah, we've built a validator client that can do 2 million transactions per second, a million transactions per second, but we don't think we can run this thing on the public internet with 1,600 nodes, let alone like the goals of Solana of even more nodes than that. It was like, okay, well, why? Like, what's wrong here? Like, is this just a fool's errand and we have to all become like 4 nodes in a data center in Tokyo to actually get fast blockchain? And they're like, well, no, like we have all these different technologies that we use in our high frequency trading network, but we can't use any of these things for this because the public internet doesn't support multicast. The public internet doesn't support traffic prioritization. Like all of these things don't exist in the public internet. But at the same time, no one in crypto would ever trust one company to run all of the network layer for Ethereum or Solana or one of these networks. And that was kind of the problem that I sat with for a while and was like, I've never worked in high performance networking. I've never worked for a trading firm before, but there's got to be a way that you can have this run by multiple independent people. And so in talking to a bunch of folks about this, the answer was basically no one does it because it sucks. And anytime you hear that type of answer, you're like, "Oh, there's an opportunity here." Like this is not like we can't build fully vertically integrated rocket production because it's like fundamentally impossible. It's just like it's capex heavy and like everyone wants to hit their quarterly earnings report. That's why the United Launch Alliance exists. And you're like, oh, SpaceX can actually do this. It's going to take a boatload of money and it's going to be much longer to ramp up than it is for like Boeing to, you know, build a rocket. But the end result is going to be massive disruption. And so that's kind of what we looked around and said, there's need, there's product market fit, and there's opportunity to do this thing. Can we actually go raise money on this though? Is this something that people are actually going to be willing to put the OpEx and the CapEx into for the ability to say we can get Solana 10 times faster in the next 2 years? I don't mean 10 times faster like the software is going to get 10 times better. That might happen too. But literally we can move 10 times the data around and we can do it with 1/100th the penalty on validators that they have today if we adopt these technologies. And so this is where, Ben, so there's a whole bunch of founding engineers, but Andrew and Matteo and I got together on this and got connected in with some folks who were working on Firedancer, being like, there's this guy who we used to like work with a bit back in 2017 who was like talking about this. Like, I wonder what he's up to. You should go talk to him. And that's kind of where the project originally came from. And so Andrew and Matteo started working on this thing in May of 2024. I got involved over the summer, and here we are now with a private testnet up and running.
That's yeah, that's actually pretty crazy. I mean, I'm imagine if like if it works the way you're describing, it's cheaper for validators, right? And it's
Yeah.
faster. It actually increases like the performance of the of Solana blockchain specifically. Like that's kind of a no-brainer, right? Like why wouldn't like what were the hangups? Did anyone have any hesitations in, well, let's say funding this, for example?
Yeah, so there's a lot, look, every single piece of there's a lot of wrong software architectures out there, but there's no right architecture. It's all about a series of trade-offs. And one of Solana's major trade-offs is it's extremely bandwidth intensive. Right? Turbine, which is the way that like state propagates out, the reason there's no pauses in blocks, like on Ethereum, it's like you build a block, you wait a bunch of time, you build another block, right? On Solana, it is just block, 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 block. There's no pause in between block production. That uses a ton of bandwidth. There's all these types of things that just require huge amounts of bandwidth usage, from Turbine to the way that like transactions land in RPCs, gossip, all this type of stuff. And so that's a big trade-off, right? And so one of the things with DoubleZero is we can dramatically reduce the amount of bandwidth a validator needs by using technologies like multicast, which is basically hardware replication of packets. So you send the packet to the network once, and then the network switches automatically replicate it and get it out to everywhere it needs to go. This is like the enterprise version of the same technology that like allows you to AirPlay to two speakers at the same time, right? Your speakers aren't pulling in like two different copies of the song or 16 copies of the song if you're in a really big house. It's one copy of the song that then the network is automatically replicating the packets and getting it out to the speakers. Now, you can't run multicast over the public internet. So the question is kind of like, why has no one done this before? And there's I would say there's three reasons no one's done it before. The overlap between people who understand high performance networking and people who care about crypto is basically zero. Like until we started DoubleZero and got a bunch of engineers to understand crypto, like we would not have been able to recruit the engineers that we've recruited to work on this thing if not for Andrew having worked with them for like 5 to 7 years and them just having built up a lot of trust. A lot of our engineers are still fairly crypto skeptical. It's really interesting to sort of be in meetings with people like, so the president of Argentina launched a meme coin and now he's under investigation, and like what is going on with this like Trump coin? I don't understand why the price is down 40% in like 2 weeks. Like all of that stuff is like, it's a huge learning curve and a huge honestly career risk when you're jumping into crypto, especially if you haven't been in the industry for a while. So one was just recruiting and getting the engineers. The second is whenever you're doing something for the first time, there's a real question of will it work? Like there was a real question in the early days of like, can you build a high performance network where one sole operator does not have root access to every box running the switches on the network? Because that's how it works today. Like if you look at like the high performance Google networks, or the high performance Jump network, or their DRW, or pick your person who runs a high performance trading network or other type of network. There's one admin. That one admin has one set of keys, and if they need to do a software update, they can do it. If they need to change something, they can do it. And so we're basically rewriting a lot of the stack from not exactly the ground up, but the control plane from first principles to make the thing operate in a way that is permissionless, that has cryptographic verification, that is all the things you know and love. But again, it requires a very specific set of expertise to actually go out and build that thing. The last reason is you need partners that are willing to believe that this will make Solana and other fast blockchains more valuable and also have an upside in that. So if you go back to like, 5 years ago, these firms, they just didn't hold crypto, right? But suddenly when you have like Galaxy and you have, DRW and you have Jump and you have all these firms saying, we actually have crypto trading desks, we invest in projects, we are building a validator client for Solana, their willingness to say, okay, we're going to carve out 10% of our global network and contribute it to DoubleZero because we think that's going to, sure, they hope that that's going to make them money from like a, token play and all these other sorts of things. But what they're really thinking about too is like, if we can make Solana 10 times faster and the blocks are 10 times larger, our validators are going to make more money. Our trading desks are going to be more profitable. It's a classic grow the pie play. And you need enough people who have enough upside to be willing to make that play. It's the same thing about how no one was building alternative validator clients for Ethereum when Ethereum was $80 and there just weren't that many engineers that have it. But as the price of an asset gets high enough, people are starting to be willing to invest in open source tooling to make that thing better just out of their own selfish economic interest.
Yep. Agreed. Okay. I think you kind of already answered this next question that I have for you, but one of our cabal members asked it, so I
Yep.
want to make sure that we actually hit it and do it for the cabal. But we're talking about increasing bandwidth, reducing latency here, right?
Yeah.
Um, Solana has had some quick related outages in the past, and if you're talking about like increasing the amount of transactions that will be coming through, how are we avoiding risks like how are we avoiding these like DDoS risks basically?
Sure. So there's probably a few different ways to think about this. The first is we're not actually asking anyone to give up their public internet connection. So this is a second connection the validator can talk out to. They can still talk to the public internet, and they can also talk to the DoubleZero network, which is again like a physically interconnected fiber network. So there's like a bunch of things there. At a high level, though, we have FPGAs in line with all these networking devices. And the FPGAs are doing things like duplicate transaction filtration. So if someone blasts, like we see this all the time, someone's like trying to do a liquidation of like a position that's about to be underwater, and they blast out like a million packets and a million transactions that are just identical copies of one another to try and flood the zone. The FPGAs will just drop that. Like, and this is all done in hardware, inline. One FPGA can support numerous downstream validators. So they'll just drop those transactions. So this is a protection layer for the validators. The second one is, and I think we've gotten everyone to sort of agree on this, is turning off payload encryption on Quick. And if we turn off payload encryption on Quick, the FPGAs can now do signature verification on all inbound transactions. So any malformed transactions that, you have to run signature verification on now, it's a fairly expensive operation on to throw out the bad stuff. What you're going to be getting out of the DoubleZero network is a stream of clean transactions that are going to pass signature verification. Now you'll still do redundant signature verification on the stuff you choose to include in the block, and also, of course, every other validator in the world will do verification when they replay your block. And so if you put a bad signature transaction in it, the block will just fail the same way that it would fail normally today. But this frees up a bunch of time on the validator to be able to do things like run a Jito block engine or, figure out better schedule optimizations. There's all sorts of things that are able to happen when you free up the resources of that validator. Additionally, we sort of have this thing right now where like you've got this like Roman phalanx, but they only let one person fight at a time. Right? It's like not the way these things are designed, right?
Yeah.
When you are the block builder, when you are the leader, you get the full brunt of every single thing coming at you from the Solana network, from state propagation. This is actually why they moved the idea of like the validator that builds the block is no longer the one that does a turbine fan out. It routes to a different node because it was like, okay, we got to offload some of this work from the main validator. This is just the logical extension of that, right? We're providing this like shared resource defense layer that can do signature verification, transaction deduplication. And we can actually do a lot more advanced things than just that over time, right? The FPGAs can actually have QoS built into them. So they can say something like, look, if there's a situation where something's getting overwhelmed, the network link is getting overwhelmed, we always want to make sure that votes get passed first. That's doable in FPGAs, right? And that's doable. And then we're going to drop, let's say, unstake weighted connections, or we're going to drop transactions, but we're not going to drop votes and we're not going to drop turbine data. So you can actually start having the network can now start basically listening to rules that are implemented by protocol engineers about what matters most and what needs to get prioritized over other pieces of data. You can't do this in the public internet today. Solana has this thing called safe mode where a validator can basically throw up a flag and say, we're going into safe mode. And the only thing that it'll process are votes and state propagation changes. And that was a thing you'd see Solana fall into every once in a while back in 22 and 23 when it got sort of overwhelmed. You can see versions of this on the networking layer too. Like the biggest DDoS attack we've ever seen on Solana was about 80 gigabits per second. Now, these FPGAs can do 100 gigabits or more of dedupe and sig verify at line rate just fine. And that's like per instance of like a DoubleZero device. So you can see a world where like we may have some of those protections even built in on the hardware side to be able to make these things like happen, which is super cool.
Yeah.
So I
That
think
is
we
that
get
is
to a
cool.
place, yeah, like we get to a place at some point um, where like this is just a global defense layer to enable these blockchains to go faster and faster.
Yes. Okay, so with that in mind, what kind of applications become possible?
Who knows?
Yeah.
Right? Like I hate to give you that answer, but like it's sort of like you watch Steve Jobs launch the iPhone, and I don't think anyone was like, this is gonna like put taxis out of business and change the way people date.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Like that wasn't what you think when you saw that come out, but like it's exactly what happened, right? Um, so it's sort of like, what would you do with 10 times more capacity on Solana? I don't know. That's not necessarily my job to figure out, right? There's 1,000 entrepreneurs out there who I'm sure all have ideas, and 990 of those ideas are terrible, and 10 of those ideas are going to change the world, right? And like this is how entrepreneurship works. And so our job is not to say, I know what people are going to build on this thing, or even I know what people should build on this thing. What I can do is describe the characteristics of the system, and a bunch of people are going to go, oh, I could try building this thing. And like again, like you go back to the pitch for Solana, and I don't think anyone was like meme coin. That'll be a thing, right? Like or NFTs. Like we're gonna do a million NFT, drops, and that'll be a big thing. The president of the United States is gonna launch a token. That was never part of the Solana like pitch deck, but these things just happen. And so, the main thing that I will say though is that crypto will become more deterministic, right? So right now, if you are trying to send a transaction, you go, your wallet talks to an RPC provider. That RPC provider hopefully has some relationship with, some stake. So it sends that all the way down to the validator it's proxying transactions through. That signs it, passes it on, and is running to catch up to wherever the leader is. Now, each of those pieces of the stage there, you're dealing with public internet infrastructure. So you have lots of latency and you have lots of jitter. And so in the traditional trading world, there is a concept of how far can I predict into the future for my willingness to make a trade? And so if I can say, I can predict where the price is going to be in 24 milliseconds with a high degree of confidence, and my execution time is 22 milliseconds with 100% certainty, I'm going to make that trade. Not as this low, no risk. My model could be wrong, but the execution risk is now completely removed. But if you are going to say like, look, it might take me 22 milliseconds to make that trade. It might take me 26 milliseconds to make that trade. Maybe you're not going to make that trade anymore. You're probably not going to make that trade because you have a 50% chance of that transaction executing after you have confidence on your future pricing model. So that's the world we're in today with crypto. It can take 200 milliseconds to get from one server to another, or it can take 180, or it can take 370. It just depends on like, how busy the lines are at that given moment. Is there a burst of traffic coming from someone else? But with DoubleZero, you are going to know it will always take, 137 milliseconds to get from this point to this point on the DoubleZero network going over this path because the network won't have any jitter and we're not going to have overflowing queues. And so we can't guarantee you inclusion. That's up to Jito, that's up to the block producer, that's up to whatever other systems are out there for actually scheduling and building blocks. But we can do is we can say your transaction or your bundle going from the Jito block engine down to the validator, it'll get there in a known quantity of time.
Yeah, that's right. And with Geo, it will get there. We'll make it happen.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. You mentioned N1 as a concept.
Yes.
What does that mean?
So an N1 is sort of a term we've made up, for lack of a better term, to define what we're building at DoubleZero. So it's not an L1, it's not an L2. This is an OSI layer 1, 2, and 3 network. This is way below the stack and where traditional blockchain comes in. And so, people keep asking like, oh, is this a new blockchain? And we're like, not really. There is a ledger under the hood for how this thing's managed, but like that's an implementation detail. Like, oh, are you guys renting servers? No, not at all. Like, we are simply building connectivity and bringing it into a bunch of different data centers around the world. And so an N1 is this network communication layer. And people can build stuff on top of it, right? Maybe something built on top of it is Solana. Maybe it's a ZK proving network. Maybe it's a high bandwidth, high availability storage network for everything from like creator videos that don't want to go up through YouTube and pay them 50% of their ad revenue. It's multiplayer game engines that don't want to have to rely on Microsoft Azure for everything. It's CDN networks like Pipe, to, other types of things too built on top of it. It's AI workload systems to move data around. There's all these sorts of systems that can be built on top of DoubleZero. Although the thing we're doing first is crypto, and the first network we're doing is Solana. You see the vision of this thing being much, much wider.
Yeah, and I think that is an important distinction to make, and I kind of want to hammer it because this is the question that I've gotten from people who have been like, "Oh, this guy's building this new internet type of thing." The first thing is like, "Oh, is it an L2?" First of all, because
Right.
they know it's like connected to Solana in some way. They're like, "Okay, is this an L2?" Or is it
Yeah.
like, "Oh, it's a new blockchain?" And it's like, "No,
Right.
it's not that either." Okay, so we'll just clear the air right there. Okay, so that was actually my next question was like, what are the misconceptions? And I think that is like the main misconception. So I don't think we need to like keep going on that. Where do you like what does blockchain infrastructure look like in the next 5 to 10 years? How does this change what the world that we live in now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one of the pieces that I look around consistently at blockchain, and I think the ambition of this space is just way too small. Everyone talks about like, oh, we're gonna like take on TradFi, we're gonna, bring a billion users online. And then even Solana's like 6,000 TPS. Maybe on a good day it's 7,000 TPS. Nothing else comes close right now. We're celebrating L2s that are doing 10,000 TPS. Um, Maybe Mega ETH hits 100,000 TPS. But there's nothing that's actually proven that it can get over 10,000 transactions per second with competitive state in a high demand in a diversity of different models. Like you can run benchmarks that show, okay, this L1 or L2 can do huge numbers. Solana runs those same benchmarks at the end of every epoch, and you can actually go look it up in the data on the end of every epoch, and it's like, oh, we can support 60,000 simple transfers per second. But we all know that that's sort of like when your Wi-Fi router is like 4.5 gigabits per second of connectivity, and you're like, dude, my Zoom is breaking up. Like where's my 4.5 gigabits? Like real world load is very different than theoretical load. And so what we are, if we're successful in this, we basically remove the entire networking layer as a constraint from software engineers. And the sort of magical thinking that governs most software engineering today of networks are perfect, bandwidth is infinite, actually is real when these folks are talking about it. Yeah, you still have the speed of light as an unfortunate bottleneck, but we're working on that. Um, but like, and so you still have like, you're never going to be able to get around the never is a big statement. In the next 10 years, you're not going to be able to get around the world faster than 240 milliseconds, right? There are certain limitations of like New York and Singapore are a certain number of miles away, and the speed of light through glass is only 2/3 of the speed of light. And like, it's going to be hard for us to beat that, right? But what we can do is we can say there's a lot better systems that you can build using this type of thing. So there are new networks popping up today that are building with the idea that they're only going to work on 000, right? They're just like, we need 40 gigabits of connectivity between all of our validators. And we're willing to say them, you have to be on the 000 network in order to operate. And that's super cool. It's going to take 2 years for these things to get built. But I'm really excited to see what happens when people say, we don't need like Hyperliquid is such an interesting example, right? Because they're doing something very different than the rest of the industry. They're giving up on decentralization theater, right? And they're sort of, because a centralized L2 is unless it truly has good exit paths in real time for real time censorship resistance, it is a centralized operation today. And Hyperliquid just is like, okay, like it's fine. We're going to run everything in Tokyo. And that's the only place you could run stuff for now. And that's fine. The vision of 000 is, what if you could make those designed trade-offs and you could say, we want to run a 60 node cluster. We don't need the 1600 validators that Solana has, but those 16 node clusters, they're going to be in 16 different countries and they're going to be on 6 different continents. And it's still going to be fast and it's still going to be very interesting and it's still going to be able to compete with a centralized exchange like a Coinbase. And that's a different direction than Solana is going to take. That's a different direction than, many other networks will take too. But the idea there is that the penalty you have for going from 4 validators in like the same region in one data center to 16 validators in 16 countries in Southeast Asia to 1,600 validators globally distributed around the world, what you get are like time-based trade-offs, right? Like you will never be able to have states synchronized in less than 200 milliseconds if you want a globally distributed validator set, period, right? Unless we start breaking the speed of light, like that's just not possible. However, that now becomes your only limiting factor. You also don't have to deal with the problem of, okay, well, the 4 validators in the same data center all have 100 gigabits of connectivity between them, and they have zero jitter, and they have deterministic latency. We can give you that exact same experience on a global scale. And so you're dealing with a very different set of trade-offs as opposed to right now. It's like, okay, we literally cannot take those validators out of the same data center because if we try and do this on the public internet, the whole thing breaks down.
That's right. Okay, man. I feel like this was just
Not sure that
like
was mid-curve.
it was. we got a little. Oh, we got a little to the right side of the curve there for a second. We need to pull it back. But it was like an overload of information. But I loved it. This was actually really interesting. The last thing, because we're already actually over our usual mid curve time. I found that mid curves can only last about 25 minutes. That's like the top. So we're already at 43 minutes. But let's do one more question, which is, what are you excited about coming up? Are there some milestones that you guys are pretty stoked about?
Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff. So obviously mainnet is exciting. We're trying to get to mainnet this year, which would be pretty awesome. That's a big one. The first 100 gigabit network link turned on the 000 network is also going to be a big one for us. That'll happen like later this spring. And so those are kind of big moments, I would say. Multicast is another really big technology for us that I think will have for a network like Solana, it will have like step function change effects. Even little things like putting votes out over multicast will make it much faster to reach finality on blocks. Those sorts of technologies I think are going to be really cool to see in production. Um, But, going forwards, like, I think really what this is about is when you're moving from a centralized Web 2 system today to a blockchain system, there's so many barriers to entry, right? And a lot of them are business type barriers, technology based barriers on like what is a wallet, what are like how do I figure out self custody of tokens, all this stuff. But one of the ones that people underestimate is the lack of determinism possible in these systems. Like if you are doing, let's take something very boring, foreign currency trading, FX trading, right? Like that is a low margin, high volume business that is very sensitive to pricing and time. And it's very hard to build that on a blockchain today because you don't have certainty about how long things take to execute. You have certainty around the blocks, but you don't have a certainty about how quickly your transaction will actually execute. And so it's little things like that that I think just, it's kind of like it's the old thing about like, how do you make a rocket 100 kilograms lighter? You take a tenth of a gram off of every screw, right? And like that is kind of, I think, some of the small things we're doing that are going to deliver value pretty quickly and pretty instantly. And then we have the really big things we're doing, like enabling multicast. And actually, like if we can get a whole chunk of Solana validators moved over to DoubleZero, we can start 2xing and then 4xing and then 10xing the block size. And the devs at Anza and Foundation and Labs and Jito can start raising protocol limits. We already see a bunch of validators today blowing past the 50 million CU limit. What does it look like if everyone is able to run 250 mil CUs? That's a pretty interesting world. It's a much more profitable world for everyone too. And so I think there's really good incentive alignment around like IBRL, honestly.
That's right. And that is a perfect place to end it, I think. So, my friend, thank you for coming on the Midcurve
Thank you.
podcast. Although you did not stick to the rules and keep it midcurve, I think we'll forgive you for that. But yeah, we should do this again, and we should definitely do something in person soon.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you so
Appreciate
much.
it.